It's a pleasure to introduce my student Ali, who I'm sure all of you know. And he's going to be defending.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for attending my final defense. This is my PhD final defense. The title is Dirty Statistical Models. My supervisor is Sujay. And during my PhD, I had the chance to collaborate with a group of other people that I listed here: Constantine Karamanis, Yudong Chen, Christopher Johnson, Pradeep Ravikumar Charwa, Nathan Shrebro, and Juan Shu. Okay, so most of you, maybe when you saw the title, you were curious that what this might mean. So let me get to the. Okay. Yeah. So let me get to the outline of my talk. First, I'm going to talk about high dimensions and the problems we have in high dimensions and the issues we are facing there. Then, I'm going to introduce dirty statistical models as a prescription to those issues. And then I'll get to two major classes of tractable algorithms, mainly convex optimization and greedy approaches. And then on each of these, I'm going to introduce one application that I worked on. Of course, there are several others that you can find on my webpage. And then I'm going to conclude my talk. Okay, so what is the motivation for my research and generally high dimensions? So in many fields nowadays, like health sciences, finance, coding, compression, pattern recognition, etc., we're facing these problems that the degrees of freedom of a system is so high that no matter how many observations I collect, the number of observations I have is negligible comparing to the degrees of freedom of the system. Or collecting one observation is so expensive that I cannot have too many observations. So I'm facing this situation that I have a true parameter x star, which is the thing I want to recover or I want to learn. And then I have some sort of instrumentation for observation, some sort of transformation, I call it in general as A. And then, of course, I have some noise in the system, and that forms one observation for me. But then this x star is lives in a p-dimensional space, so I'm trying to find p different variables. But the number of observations I can take, n, is much smaller than that. Okay? So then if I define a problem that given y and a find x star, this is obviously an ill-posed problem because you have less equations than variables, so there are many things that can satisfy your observation. So what do we do? Well, one way to solve this problem is to make an assumption or leverage some information that we have about the physics of the system or about the nature to restrict our x star to some set C. And then people have shown that if this set C has certain properties, then this problem becomes well posed. Okay? Examples of this that you might have seen: sparsity, block sparsity, it has application compressed sensing, multitask learning, low rank, Hankel in system identification, etc., etc. Okay? But the whole idea is that I restrict my parameter to be in some set C, and this set C comes from my knowledge of the system. Okay? So how do we solve, in general, these kind of problems? Because this has been of interest in recent years. So so we want to solve y equals ax star plus w, which means we want to find something which is consistent with our observation, and then subject to the fact that this is in some set C. Okay? So there are two general tractable algorithms, two classes of algorithm, if you will. One is convex optimization based algorithm. In this class of algorithm, we introduce some sort of penalty or loss function that assigns to each x that I think it assigns some penalty. Okay? And then I also define some sort of regularizer, And this regularization is something that characterizes basically that my set C. Okay, and we'll get to it, some examples, and you'll see. It sometimes is combinatorial, non-convex, and we do some sort of convexification. We find some convex targets, and then we solve this. Another class of algorithms are greedy algorithms. In greedy approach, we have this sort of atomic view of the set C. So we are thinking of some set C, which is a collection or span of some set of atoms. And then we gradually pick best or worst atom depending on our algorithm. And then we have updates of this form. That at each iteration xt is the previous estimation plus or minus some portion of that atom. Okay? But for people with CS background, I should emphasize that this greedy algorithm, when we talk here, is not a classical approximation greedy algorithm that provides some approximation of the NP-hard problem. Here we are talking about exact recovery, and I'll get to example and we'll see the difference. But what are the issues with this class of algorithm? Okay. So one issue is that, okay, let's consider a simple PCA problem. You have a bunch of points in a high-dimensional space, but these points are approximately in a low-dimensional subspace, and you want to find an affine subspace that goes through all of them, or approximately goes through all of them. So one way to do that is that you put all this data as a columns of a matrix. You do PCA, you pick the principal component, or principal components, depending on the dimension of your space. And then you get some subspace that those data are close to. Okay, very simple algorithm, very well known, and people using a lot of application. But what are the issues? So there are two fundamental issues with this class of algorithm. One is the one that I refer to as robustness. And robustness is that with single outlier, I can arbitrarily change my solution. So just adding one point, just one single point, can make a dramatic change in your solution. So it's not robust, it's a strict outlier. The other issue, I refer to it as flexibility. And flexibility is the issue where you have a multimodal data, and if you try to fit such a low-dimensional subspace, you get something that might not be either of those ones. It might be something completely both. Okay? So we are facing these two problems. So what can we do? The prescription we have for these two fundamental issues is Dirty Statistical Model. And what is Dirty Statistical Model? It's a very simple idea. The idea is that if you have your data represents in two sets or bunch of sets, just consider superposition of them. For instance, here, if my blue dots are my data and red dots are my outliers, I write them as the sum of blue dots plus outliers. Okay, the superposition of these two models. Or if this is one mode of my data, this is another mode of my data. Again, I can separate these two modes and represent them as the superposition of two simple models. And then let's try to learn each of these models separately, but not quite separately. I get to the details how we can do this. But this idea is very simple. So to address the issue of robustness, we assume that our data has a simple structure, and this is kind of a non-benign noise or outlier. And but we need some further assumption that also these outliers are also in the low-dimensional subspace. Otherwise, there is no hope. Which means, for instance, the number of outliers is small compared to the number of true data. And you can imagine if that's not the case, really the problem doesn't make sense. And to issue the flexibility, we consider just a superposition of two different structures. Okay? So if I go back to the problem of PCA, you can see here now instead of me thinking of X as a single structure, I think of it as a superposition of two structures, each one of them coming from separate sets. And to issue the robustness, I assume that x1 represents the original data, x2 is outlier. So if I want to do estimation, I'll just output x1. And if I am in a multimodal data case, I just consider each of them to be one mode of the data, and I have to solve. These two problems turned out to be different in the sense that in the case of robustness, we require these two sets to be separable, because what we are doing really, we're separating two structures. Whereas if we solve flexibility problem, we don't need to separate them as long as, because what we care about is really, at the end, superposition of the two. So we have some slack there, so these two structures can be relatively, one can go up, one can go down, and it can be determined by the algorithm dynamic. Okay? Here is a kind of summary of all of the methods that we can think of in this context. So we have simple models, and we have robust and flexible models, these dirty models that I introduced to you. And there are greedy and convex on both sides. These are my works on each of these areas. During my qualifying exam, I talked about sparse and Laurent decomposition and graph clustering with Sujay, because recently I have another graph clustering paper with Natish Rebro using maximum. I talked also about multitask learning using convex optimization. Today, I'm going to talk about another 3 pieces of my work. So I'll be talking about time series analysis. And I'll also talk about this class of greedy algorithm that seems to be very interesting, and perhaps you might be able to use it in your own research. Okay, so any questions so far about the setting of the third model?